welcome everyone to the Looking at Art Gallery here at Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. I'm Jo Meacock and I'm the Curator of British Art, and I'm going to be talking today about this painting here by the Scottish artist Henry Raeburn, and it's called Boy and Rabbit, and it dates from around 1814, and I hope to show in my talk that it's really quite a significant painting in lots of different ways. First of all, the artist, Henry Raeburn, he was a key painter of the Scottish Enlightenment. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was unusual in building up a successful portrait practice here in Scotland, in Edinburgh actually, rather than feeling the need to go down to London like many of his contemporaries did. He basically painted the Scottish elite of his day, so judges and politicians, writers, intellectuals, landowners. He painted them. He painted over 1,000 portraits in all, and his portraits are notable for their expressiveness, their freedom in brushwork and the directness, and their lack of idealisation. He was actually portrait painter to King George IV in Scotland, and he was the first Scottish member of the prestigious Royal Academy in London, and this was his diploma piece. It was painted, as I said, around 1814 and submitted in 1816. Originally, Raeburn had submitted a self-portrait, but this was disallowed under Royal Academy rules. Now, this painting's interesting as a child portrait. This is a time when children were beginning to be treated as children and not just as mini adults. And so you can see a kind of new informality creeping into this portrait. There's a lovely kind of intimacy and relaxed nature about this painting, and the boy's sitting in a kind of relaxed attitude that's maybe typical of a child. The clothes he wears are the beginning of kind of children's wear. They're intended for movement and for play, and they're easily laundered as well. So it's very interesting in that regard. But it's even more interesting as a child portrait because the artist knew the sitter, and this perhaps says it helps explain why there's such a kind of intimacy and relaxed kind of feel to this painting. The sitter is actually the artist's step-grandson, Henry Raeburn Inglis. Now, Raeburn married in 1778 a rich widow called Anne Leslie. She was the daughter of Peter Edgar of Bridgelands, and she married a Count Leslie, a Count James Leslie, and they had 3 children, and the mother of Henry here, Anne, was one of these 3 children, and she had 2 sons, Charles and Henry here, who was born in 1806. So he was around 8 years old when this particular painting was made, and he was brought up at Deanhaugh House, which was the maternal home, which Raeburn lived in for a while as well. Now, Henry Raeburn Inglis here, the little boy, he's also interesting because he was actually deaf. And if you look at this painting, it seems to be very much tied up with the senses. You'll see how the boy has his arm around his pet rabbit and he's fondling the rabbit's fur. And he's also feeding it dandelion leaves. Now, Raeburn did fairly often paint his sitters beside animals, sometimes horses or dogs, occasionally a rabbit. There's another picture of a child portrait of a girl with a rabbit here that you can see. This is the children of Professor Dougald Stewart, and it's in the National Trust collection. But I think the relationship between the boy and the rabbit in this painting is particularly important. We've been working with our deaf guides on the interpretation around this painting, and they mentioned how important animal relationships are for deaf people and how often close bonds can be formed. Sometimes day-to-day interactions can be frustrating, there can be miscommunications, but often there's no such kind of communication barriers with animals, and it's like the animals instinctively understand. One deaf guide talked about her 2 deaf sons who would often be maybe stressed by school, but would come home and immediately be calmed by their family dog. So I think the relationship between this boy and his pet rabbit is really quite significant here. Now, Henry, the little boy here, he was brought up in Edinburgh, and it wasn't perhaps the worst place to be brought up as a deaf young boy at the time. And in fact, Edinburgh was the first place in the UK to have its own deaf school, the Braidwoods Academy, which was founded in 1760. Unfortunately, in the mid-1780s, the school was relocated to London, and there wasn't a deaf school for a while. But in 1799 to 1805, in the Edinburgh directories, it mentions an institution for the dumb and defective of speech, which is maybe a bit distasteful sounding to us today, but was a deaf school. And a second Braidwood school also opened up in 1810, and Henry may well have attended the second Braidwood school. The Braidwood schools were really pioneering because they taught lip reading and also an early form of signing. We don't know, however, if Henry did attend the Braidwood school. He may have been schooled at home, but what we do know is that he went on to higher education. In 1824, he was admitted into Edinburgh's art school, the Trustees' Academy. Now, our deaf guides again said that in their experience, deaf people are often drawn to creative and expressive professions that use their hands. So it's quite interesting that this little boy went on to become an artist. But he was no doubt also inspired by the example of his grandfather, and probably had access to his grandfather's studio and maybe his materials as well. And he was no doubt an encouragement to the young boy. Raeburn may also have been inspired Henry may also have been inspired by Walter Geekie. Walter Geekie was another Edinburgh deaf artist. He attended the Braidwood School in 1810 and then went on to study at the Trustees' Academy, and in fact he was the first deaf person to enter the Trustees' Academy. And he became very well known in Edinburgh, drawing scenes of quite comical, satirical scenes of Edinburgh life. He became a member of the Royal Scottish Academy and exhibited frequently. I've got an example of the kind of humorous everyday life scenes that Walter Geekie produced. So he may well have been a source of inspiration, and his entrance to the Trustees' Academy may have paved the way for subsequent deaf people to come to the school. He may also have been inspired by Joshua Reynolds, the president of the Royal Academy in London. Joshua Reynolds wasn't born deaf, but he became deaf in his 20s after a riding accident, and he could only hear with a hearing trumpet. This did affect his day-to-day interactions with people, but in no way curbed his ambition and his enthusiasm, and he became one of the most important painters of his day, as well as the president of the Royal Academy. So what a role model for the young Henry to have. We don't know much about Henry's professional life as an artist. There are no works by him in public collections in the UK. There may be some in private collections. An 1861 census, when he was 56 years old, describes his profession as an annuitant. So he wasn't described as an artist at that point. He was obviously living off his inheritance. But that doesn't mean to say that he still wasn't painting and living as an artist. This is a really inspiring portrait. It must have been so difficult for Henry to get to art school and to make it as an artist. And yet he did it against the odds. A contemporary of the day talked about deaf people doomed to ignorance, idleness and uselessness. This was the kind of environment that he was brought up in. And the area where the first deaf school was established is still known today as Dumby Dykes. There was so much prejudice and misunderstanding. So it's really quite something that this little boy went on to actually study at the Trustees' Academy and become an artist. And it is a wonderful portrait. And it's also a wonderful portrait and kind of saying something about a relationship between a grandfather and a grandson and a boy and his pet rabbit. And you won't be surprised to learn that it's been a very popular painting with our visitors, particularly with our young visitors. And we've had a number of workshops around this painting, particularly with some deaf children, and we had an animal handling session which enabled us then to move on and talk about the painting, which was very successful. The painting is with us until June next year. It's on loan to us from the Royal Academy collections. We're very lucky to have it, and we've got a programme of events planned around the painting, so I hope you enjoy it.